welcome to all of you. It's magnificent that so many people have come, and I'm sure we're in for a huge treat. It's my pleasure to introduce the rest of the senior members, obviously. Brendan Callaghan is a Jesuit priest and a psychologist, and he combines those two things, spirituality, theology, and psychology brilliantly. He's also master of Campion Hall, which is where the Jesuits hang out in Oxford. Can you hear me? Right. Well, we may have to try the microphone, but yes, enjoy the talk.
Questions, can you hear me? I can hear me, so I presume you can. I can hear it bouncing back. So I'm delighted to have the invitation. Equally delighted that the dire comments I have made, not about the warmth of the welcome, but the actual temperature warmth of the surroundings is not quite as bad as I thought. I brought my big leather jacket to speak in if necessary. What I want to do is to talk to you about one aspect of Ignatius. You have a whole range of possibilities in listening to different people speaking about Ignatius in the course of this series this term. And I want to talk about one aspect of his work, or rather one way of looking at most of his work. I'm a psychologist by training. I spent 3 happy years at the bottom of the science area of the university, tapping snails on the head and measuring how far they took their horns in. I jest not. And at the end of which they gave me a psychology degree. But in fact, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and it was all a giant Jesuit sandwich course, so it was all part of a big plot. The last 30 years or so, I've taught psychology and religion, psychology of religion, at Eton in the University of London, which is where Jesuits hang out in the University of London, as distinct from Oxford. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Ignatius as a psychologist. I think he's a very great psychologist, though he doesn't use the language that they use down in the Department of Experimental Psychology, nor indeed in any other psychology department that I've ever come across. But I think he has some good insights to share, and I think aspects of psychology can perhaps help us see something of what it is that he's saying. So it's not a complete guide to Ignatius. I'm not echoing my American friend Jim Martin's approach of the Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything. It's a great book title, I recommend the book, but that's not what I'm doing. I'm looking at particular parts of how Ignatius works, and the lenses I'm using are the lenses of psychology. But first, a little bit of background. Now, some of you may already know a little bit about the life of Ignatius. If you do, please do stay alert, because I may be sliding in things that you don't know that are relevant to what I want to say. So, just a brief biography. He's born in 1491. He's born to some local middling rank nobility in the Basque country. He gets packed off. He's the junior son of the household, and he gets packed off to spend time in the household of the treasurer of the Kingdom of Castile. His own description is there in italics, and since some of you are sitting behind pillars, I'll read. A man given over to the vanities of the world, took a special delight in the exercise of arms, with a great and vain desire of winning glory. This is Ignatius on Ignatius. Slightly confusingly, when he gets autobiographical, he speaks in the third person. He doesn't say I, he says he. So this is Ignatius describing Ignatius. He's a courtier. He's a courtier who wore a sword rather than a soldier who knew his way around at the battlefield. And that's eminently visible when you look at his history, his military history, which is brief, glorious, and incredibly incompetent. In 1521, he's sent with a group of soldiers to help relieve the siege of Pamplona, which the French are besieging, Pampeluna. And the local military commander has sussed out the size of the armies in good biblical fashion. One king comes against another and all the rest of it, and has decided that it's prudent to surrender. Ignatius arrives full of valour, seeking glory, persuades them to fight on, and as you may know, has his legs smashed by a passing cannonball. He spends months recuperating, mainly because, having had his leg reset, I hope you've finished your cups of coffee, all right? Having had his leg reset on the battlefield and carried home by the French, or rather by his own soldiers, with the protection of the French, because they were so impressed by his act of gallantry, he gets home and discovers that it's set crook. So he gets them to re-break it. Think about this. This is the days before anaesthetics. And they re-break it, and he looks at it again and he says, no, there's a bone sticking out the side. It's going to spoil the cut of my tights. So he gets them to saw the bone off. Everybody does that, yeah. Bad news for our tummies, bad news for him in one sense, good news in another way, because he spends months and months and months recuperating. He spends his time in bed because he can't get up and walk on this really quite badly damaged leg, and he hasn't got much to read. He's back in the household where he grew up, where his older brother was the sort of lord of the manor. Those lives of the saints, not very much. Military households or minor nobility in that bit of the Basque country at that time were not big into collecting books, and so he didn't have a lot to read. He did have some lives of the saints. He didn't have the sort of Basque country equivalent of Mills and Boon, the Golden Legend and all the rest of it, the stories of great daring do, which he had read and heard elsewhere. So he reads and he daydreams. I think people daydreamed an awful lot more in those days than we do today. We switch the television on, we probably do much the same, or depending on our generations, we go on to the internet, or if we're really up and coming, we get into our social media. But people did the equivalent stuff, but in their heads, I think, in Ignatius's day. So he daydreams. He daydreams about imitating knights errant. He daydreams about imitating the saints. And I'm forgetting to take you on. I'm so sorry. Let me just let this catch up. I was getting carried away. Okay. And he starts noticing after a bit that his daydreams have different effects. That they're great fun while he's lying there imagining being a heroic knight errant. They're also quite fun when he's lying there imagining being a saint imitating Dominic or whoever it might be. And then he starts noticing the after effects. That when he's thinking about, this is again his turn, that when he used to think about that worldly stuff, he'd take much delight. But when he left it aside after getting tired, he'd find himself dry and discontented. But when imagining about going to Jerusalem barefooted, about not eating except herbs, about doing all the other rigours he was seeing the saints have done, not only used he to be consoled while in such thoughts, but he would remain content and happy even after setting them aside, having left them aside. And he doesn't really kind of get into this until it suddenly dawns on him that there is this difference. And it's a consistent difference that he observes in his own experience. From some thoughts he used to be left sad, and from others happy. And he starts thinking about, well, what might be at work here? And little by little, he says, coming to know the difference in kind of spirits that were stirring, the one from the devil and the other from God. Good influences and bad influences. His language is a language of spirits, good spirits and bad spirits. And we might or might not find that an easy language to use, but what he's observing in himself seems to me we can talk about him in any sort of language. Okay, so out of that experience, let me just back up a little bit. Out of that experience, grows his own shift, his own conversion of life, if you will. And out of that experience grows the thought that maybe what he has begun to observe and the ways of praying that he's been engaged in may be of service to other people. And from prolonged period of prayer and reflection, not just when he's lying there in Loyola on his sickbed. If you're in that part of the Basque Country, it's a bit south of Bilbao, the house is still there, the room is still there. It's one of those places, a little bit like Littlemore, where you can reach out and sort of touch the presence of the person who marks the place. Not just there, but at Manresa, not so far away, throughout the following years when he's reorganizing his life, studying to look to be ordained as a priest. He's reflecting on his experience, making notes, and coming up with a little set of what he calls exercises. Exercises for the spirit. Exercises that can help us get the core of our lives into shape, just as physical exercise can help us get if we do it, can get the physical aspects of our lives into shape. The parallel is an absolutely direct one with Ignatius. And he comes up with a little book of instructions, which is known as now as the spiritual exercises. It's a book of instructions, if you will, for the spiritual equivalent of a personal trainer. Right? It's not a book to pick up and read and go and be inspired by. All right? It's a book helping somebody help someone else pray. So it's not full of pious meditations or anything like that. It's a book full of little steps and points and instructions and hints and offerings. And there were two key tools to it seems to me, and neither of them are original. Ignatius was not original in the sense of coming up with totally new insights, except perhaps one absolutely crucial one. So the tools that he makes use of, he pulls together from all sorts of places, and you can trace back some of his sources very easily. Imaginative engagement with gospel events, and a few para-gospel events as well. So while he asks people praying in the pattern of the exercises, for example, to take events which are recorded in the gospel, healing miracles, the nativity, the crucifixion, and so on, when you get towards the end of it, one of the first events he asks people to pray about after the resurrection of Jesus is Jesus meeting his mother. Brackets. I slightly paraphrase. Okay, so it's not in the Gospels. But for heaven's sake, we're asked to use our brains, aren't we? Close brackets. All right, so a few para-gospel events as well. He also presents some of the great Christian themes in imaginal form. And then he asks us to be faithful and attentive and prayerfully attentive to our own faith story. And none of that is particularly original. People have been invited to pray over the Gospels, to pray in an imaginative way over the Gospels, to think about their own faith story. That wasn't particularly new. I think what he does that is new, in addition to this engaging with Scripture, reflecting on my life, is that last step. And one way of thinking about it is a kind of Ignatian pause, an Ignatian moment of reflection, or moments of reflection, noting my response to what I've been engaged with. Doing in my case, in my place and my time and from my experience, what he did when he suddenly started noticing back there on the sick bed in Loyola the different ways of prayer, of imagining, daydreaming to begin with, left him in different moods. That how he moved interiorly, how his emotions moved and changed, his deep feelings, how they changed. That was what got him moving. That's what got him thinking, and he invites us to do the same. And that seems to me it seems to me, is the original touch. Not just think about your life or think about the scriptures, get engaged in prayer, the central themes of Christian living, but when you've done it, take a pause and think back on what happened inside. How did your own moods and feelings shift as you prayed through this imaginary scene, as you recall this bit of your life, as you engaged with this major aspect of our shared Christian heritage? So absolutely crucial in Ignatius's approach is this willingness to be aware of how I react, what sort of response they elicit in me at the deepest levels of my experience. It seems to me there are two tasks that he asks us to engage in. This is the, I don't know whether you remember whichever television program it was, had the summarised Proust competition, where people had to sum up the whole of Latin Church, what they had to do in 30 seconds or whatever it was. Well, this is kind of the summarised Proust version of Ignatius, all right? I'm picking out key ideas. So one way of thinking about what he asks us to do is to see us being invited to engage in two tasks. At this point, can I just make a comment? First of all, the teddy bears, which you may or may not be able to see, guarding the projector, are partly provided by St. Giles, but some of them have come with their companions who are among you in the audience. And I have to say, I shot out of the house so fast, I forgot to bring mine with me. But they're also sitting on top of a few copies of the text of what appears on the screen, all right? I haven't brought enough for everybody. It may be possible to get copies, but if you see something on the screen and you think, gosh, I want to catch that before he changes the slide, right? There are a few copies here and more copies will be available. I'm trusting that reaction will be stimulated by Ignatius being quoted or other people. But anyway, let me just say that at this point. Okay. So he asks us to engage in two tasks: immersing myself in this prayerful fantasy, in gospel events, and allowing myself to recognize the way in which God has been and is tangibly present in my life. That second exercise is embedded in and perhaps sort of focused in the way of prayer, the pattern of prayer of the Ignatian examen, and that's something that's going to be spoken about by my great colleague Jerry W. Hughes on the 21st of February, where Jesuits hang out in Oxford, namely Campion Hall. We've made life really complicated because we have two of my Jesuit province called Jerry Hughes, and they both write books, and they both now live at Campion Hall, and they're forever being asked to sign each other's books. But Jerry W. is the man who wrote God of Surprises and the rest of them, and he's going to talk about the example. Let me just touch on it there. Allowing myself to recognize the ways in which God has been and is tangibly present in my life. It seems that both of those tasks, the gospel-centered prayer and reflection on my life, engage the whole of us. Not just our intellects, though they engage our intellects, they're not exercises without reflection or cognition, but above all, they engage our imaginations and the life of our feelings. Because what Ignatius is asking me to recognize is not what's there in the creed, what's there in the Catechism of the Church, what's there in the 39 Articles, whatever it might be. He's not asking me to recognize the general truths of our common belief, but the very particular truths of how God engages with me, and how I both cooperate with and resist that engagement. So it's very much a sort of focused way of prayer. Within the context of belief, Ignatius is working within Christendom, if you will. Not just within a geographical boundary, but within a whole way of thinking and a whole way of understanding what it is to respond to the gospel and to live according to the gospel. So he doesn't talk about that, except very, very briefly in some of the notes at the end of the exercises. He takes that as given and asks us within that, okay, how are you responding to what God is offering you in your life, what God is inviting you to in your life? The same insight has been expressed in our own century, in the last century, by the American Trappist monk Thomas Merton. For me, sanctity consists in being myself. For you, sanctity consists in being yourself. Therefore, the problem of sanctity and salvation is in fact the problem of finding out who I am and of discovering my true self. And a sometime fellow Jesuit of mine, who then saw the light, moved on and got married, David Lonsdale, a great teacher of Ignatian spirituality, puts it like this: taking possession of ourselves, telling, retelling and reflecting on the history of God's dealings with us helps us to set us on the road to freedom. True freedom is the ability to become the person God destined me to be, the capacity to allow my relationship with God, and hence the grace of God, to determine the shape and the direction of my life. Okay, so, what's Ignatius doing, particularly in the imaginative prayer component of the exercises? Let's just park the examining, the reflection on my life for a time. I'll let Jerry speak to you about that at length and with great wisdom. But what's Ignatius doing with imaginative prayer? Seems to me that one of the things he's doing across the cycle of the exercises, which when taken, so to speak, full on and full time, last about a month, though many people either make a shorter version or adopt it as a framework for prayer through their lives. But if you look at the 4 weeks of the exercises, it seems to me that within those 4 weeks, I'm having put in front of me these key fundamental images and symbols of the gospel. Archetypal Christian symbols of life. The gospel stories, imagined scenes, the two standards, the two battle flags, meditation for example, Christ and the bad spirit and Satan confronting each other. The images of the different classes of people faced with difficult decisions and having different degrees of generosity. He doesn't give us creedal formulas. He doesn't give us pious formulas. He gives us images and symbols to work with. So we are left with a measure of freedom as to how we engage with those symbols, it seems to me. Encountering those symbols, if I really engage with them, and if they are the key symbols around which I shape my life, then encountering those symbols changes me. Can't do other than that. Seems to me in the exercises, Ignatius does precisely that. He puts me regularly in contact with these key symbols, so it shouldn't be a surprise if in coming back to them again and again, really engaging with them, really allowing them to touch me, that I'm changed. I'm changed by that encounter. Let me say, as a kind of, bracket, and going back to last term's series on Benedictine spirituality. It is last term, isn't it? Yeah? Yeah. It seems to me that the pattern of Benedictine monastic life, immersed in the liturgy and the psalms, does precisely the same. It confronts the monk or the one praying in that tradition again and again and again with those key symbols. It's a different way of doing it. Ignatius has come up with a way of maintaining that engagement which fits into a non-monastic style of life. But fundamentally he's doing the same as the rule of St. Benedict does, fostering this regular and deep engagement with symbols of that which is most central in our lives. So I'm changed by that. But then also, so are the symbols. Symbols are symbols, and symbols change and move and grow. Okay, let's change gear into a slightly more explicitly psychological approach. I want to introduce you to Donald Winnicott. I think a very interesting child psychoanalyst of children. Child psychoanalyst for me always conjures up that American television series of all these sort of Doogie something or other who was a sort of teenage doctor. But Winnicott was an analyst who worked with small children. And one of his insights is that in very early life, we don't have any great sense of separateness. It's quite difficult to get our heads around this, because we're very aware of ourselves as separate people, and separate beings, and that I sort of stop here, and that's not me, and you're not me. But very small babies, Winnicott suggests, out of his working with later smaller children, very small babies don't have that sense. Whatever happens, there isn't me and not me. There is just, what's there? It includes me, and I don't have a sense of not me. So if I'm feeling hungry and I'm fed, then somehow I've done it. If I'm feeling cold and I get warmed up, then somehow, because there's nothing else there that's separate from me, it must be me. So there's something verging on omnipotence in the experience of the very small child, the very small baby. In Winnicott's terms, the baby both creates and discovers the breast. I'm hungry, I need to feed, and lo and behold, just what I needed is right there, right where I need it. It's a kind of, I'm making it happen and I'm discovering it at the same time. But it doesn't always happen. It doesn't always happen at the time that I want it to happen. Mother isn't always present. And slowly, I become aware in those first few months that it's not just me. There is me and there is not me. And really importantly, there's me and, I put quotes around, mother. In other words, whoever is mothering me in these early months. Mother is never continually present. Though, I have to say, I still remain stunned by what I regard as an almost preternatural ability of mothers of small children to hear, small children, sort of 50 miles away wailing, whatever it might be, be able to pick out their own child. Mother isn't always there, and in fact it's because Mother isn't always there that I begin to have a more objective and reality-based take on life. Okay. But it's very scary. I'm hungry, and Mother's not there. I'm cold, and Mother's not there. I need changing, and Mother's not there. I need a cuddle, and Mother's not there. What do? I need something that's going to, if I may, I'm not sure whose permission I need to ask. I need something that's going to keep me reassured. I need a transitional object, something that carries me through this very scary move from just me, so to speak, to me and everything else. So the traditional stereotype of the transitional object is indeed the teddy bear. Okay? Not everybody has a teddy bear. Linus had a blanket. I had a niece. She'd kill me if she knew I was telling this story. But I have lots of nieces, so I won't tell you which one. I had a niece who had a little soft toy white furry cat, which was known as Grice, which as far as we could work out was spelled Grice. And we thought that's really sweet, because her second name, got to remember, not preview her first name, her second name was Grace. And we thought it was really sweet that her cat was called Grice, because we thought it was a mispronunciation. Until my brother, her father, who was a religious education teacher, walked past one moment, and she was holding this little fluffy cat and saying, Grice has died, Grice has risen. So we have these objects which carry us through those scary moments and which help us in the transition from being omnipotent through the, oh my Lord, I'm not omnipotent, who's going to look after me, through to a sense, a realistic sense of the... But crucially, these transitional objects are not simply out there, right? And they're not simply a product of our imaginations, our internal fantasy. They're in some sort of between space. Okay? Play closes the gap between what's simply inside my head and what's out there and looking for something solid and measurable, and in that sense, real world. Play closes the gap between those two worlds. When I'm playing, if I'm a child or not, I can manipulate external objects, discern what's going on inside my head, my dreams, and I can do the reverse, so to speak. I can invest objects out there in the world with meaning for me, dream meaning and feeling, symbolic meaning and feeling. So, in this between space, in this transitional space, I'm actually doing some of the most important things that human beings do, I think. It's not just, I nearly said, just play. I don't believe anything is just play. Play is one of the most important things we do. But it's not, what I'm engaged in this process is not simply described in terms of children playing with teddy bears and empty boxes or whatever it might be. But it's also the same process that gives rise to symphonies, sculptures, scientific theories that are manipulating the external world in terms of our internal symbolic world, that investing the external world with meaning and value, that being touched by meaning and value from the external world in my internal world. So much of the most important things we do, from engaging with each other as loving individuals, to attending the theatre or the opera, or engaging in all sorts of different play and creativity, down there in the science area, even maybe tapping snails on the head and measuring how far they take their horns in, is all part of this same sort of process. And what we're doing is, in fact, working with symbols. We're learning working with symbols. I'm leaving out the words how to, because it's not that sort of learning. It's more like learning riding a bicycle. You don't learn to ride a bicycle by saying, now I put this foot down and now I pick this one up, and all the rest of it. You learn riding a bicycle, and it's not at this sort of level, it's at head level. Okay. Within this intermediate space, this transitional space, this between space, between what's inside my head and what's out there in the concrete, measurable, reliable Oxford University science area world, we also find the transcendent. We also find the whole. And a Dutch-American depth psychologist called Paul Price, I think that's how to pronounce his name, says when we look at how we function in relation to the transcendent, we find we're operating in that same intermediate world. It's neither purely subjective, nor is it purely objective, but it's somewhere between the two. And that gets us back, you may have seen where we're leading to, that gets us back via symbols to what Ignatius is doing, it seems to me, in the exercises. Because what he's allowing me to do, it seems to me, and here's one way of speaking about it anyway, is to provide a sort of reality check. I come face to face, again and again, with these guiding images and symbols of the Christian community to which I belong. And they're going to be slightly different from community to community at the level of, let's say, at the level of the great divisions of Christendom into its different denominations, east and west, as well as the form and all the rest of it. But also within those denominations, one of the aspects, it seems to me, which gathers us together in particular communities is precisely the ways in which particular symbols speak to us or don't speak to us, the particular forms of ritual and symbolic action and image which touch us powerfully over against those which don't, and so on. I'm coming face to face with these symbols again and again and again. But in my constant re-engagement with them, it seems to me, sorry, I left out a step. Let me go back. The great symbols that we share across Christianity, the particular ways in which our particular denomination gives shape to those symbols, even more particular ways which my community gives shape to those symbols, and finally the last step, which I left out, how I shape those symbols. Because for me, they're going to have a particular shape. One of the most startling experience for many people is if they are able to talk with others, perhaps with whom they've prayed and shared worship and so on for years, but they're actually able to talk with others about their images of God. Oh, that's how you image God. It's not how I image God. It's quite different, right? The discovery that at that personal level we shape our particular images in very particular ways. I could talk to you for the rest of the afternoon about what gives rise to that, but I'm not going to, all right? Relax. But what I do want to pick up is this notion of the individuality of our symbols. So, inevitably, those symbols are shaped by my own experience, largely at the less than conscious level, largely shaped by my unconscious and what in me they have engaged with, what bits of my family story, my relational story, whatever. If I come back to them, those symbols can be reshaped. If I re-engage with them, they can catch up with where I am. If I simply, pardon me, once again, I'll take another teddy bear. If I simply sort of park the symbols out of sight and don't pay any attention to them, they're going to get stuck. And the images I have of God are going to be the images which are entirely appropriate when I was 5 or 6 or 7 or 14 or whatever it might be. But because I haven't actually allowed myself to meet them and engage with them, they're inappropriate for an adult. Let me restore this teddy bear to where I think most teddy bears are heat, but anyway, let's put him back where he belongs. Okay. So, what does Ignatius allow me to do? He allows me to confront these symbols, and therefore, for these symbols to be updated, if you will. Perhaps it's the computer which suggests that for me. Okay. They can be reshaped in ways that reflect where I am. And what we need to be aware of, centrally, is that how we represent God to ourselves is influenced by these symbols, by these, if you will, lower level symbols. And so, as these symbols catch up and are reshaped by my life experience, and of course in turn affect how I go about my living, so my representation of God changes and moves ahead. Many psychologists would say, moves ahead of it, keeps drawing me on. Okay. Ignatius helps me upgrade my faith. It helps me upgrade my lived relationship with God and with others. And crucially, it seems to me, he makes it easier for me to let go of what might be an idolatrous image of God, where I'm holding on, or at least an idolatrous attachment to a particular image of God. This is how I spoke about God when I was in Sunday school at 7. Don't ask me to change it. This is what I'm holding on to. And if I don't think there's any other way of imaging God or thinking about God, of course I'm going to hold on. It's far too scary to let go. Okay? But if I'm offered the opportunity to encounter other images of God that speak to me more powerfully in my current state of life, my current age, my current relationships, whatever it is, then I can let go. I can let go, not of God, but of images of God which belong to somebody much, much younger than I am. Okay, so, back to where we began. 2 tasks or one. Ignatius asks me in the exercises to make use of scripture-based prayer, and he asks me to make use of the examen, this patterned, at least initially patterned and very structured way of reflecting on how I've been sensing my cooperation with God or my resistance to God in the warp and woof, the fabric of my everyday life, and noting my responses to both. And it seems to me that one of the things that goes on when I do that, there's a lot of text there, which is why I'm telling you there's some copies. One of the things that happens when I do that is I come to a kind of felt understanding that any way we talk about God is a way of talking about God. It isn't God. It's necessarily a way of talking about God. The Jewish philosopher, theologian, Abraham Heschel, has this lovely notion that when we're really sharing our experience as religious people, all formulations and articulations disappear as understatements. It's a great notion. Everything we say about God is an understatement. Quite how Heschel puts it, but it seems to me that it's a legitimate way of understanding it. So we come to see in prayer that how we, not just how we speak about God, but how we represent God, our images of God, are images of God and symbols of God. They're other than God. One of the great sins of the 3 Abrahamic religions is idolatry, is putting in place of God something other than God, even if what we put in place of God is an image of God. So Judaism forbids the speaking of the name of God. Islam has a ban on pictorial representations, almost any pictorial representation, but certainly any pictorial representation which attempts to be a representation of the divine. I think Christianity, we have to work at it in different sorts of ways. Okay. So, our representations of God are just that. It seems to me that in the exercises, I'm inevitably reshaping my image of God. I've kind of sort of said that already. But getting stuck with an image of God, being unable to move on, it seems to me, and anybody who's helping other people in prayer, or anybody who reflects on their own prayer, knows that if we get stuck with a particular image of God, then we really do get stuck. It's an obstacle to growth. Okay. So, what am I saying here? Yes, if I change my image of God, if I allow that to change, and that's a central relationship in my life, my relationship to God, then how I understand myself and how I image myself also shifts. Those two sets of images, those 2 ways of representing are absolutely interlocked. Interestingly enough, say some psychologists, whether I actually believe in God or not, my image of God and my self-image are very tightly interlocked. Okay. So it seems to me that one thing that Ignatius does, another way of thinking about what Ignatius does, is to allow myself to tell always new stories about the ways in which my life is caught up in God's love. And crucially, as I tell and retell these stories and discover new ways of telling my story in relation to God's story, how God's story and my story are woven together, each retelling, it seems to me, is going to be a closer approximation to the truth. These are not fictions, these are closer and closer approximations to the truth. Winnicott says that we come to a first sense of who we are as separate from that little omnipotent being when we see ourselves mirrored in the loving gaze of our... It seems to me that something similar is what awaits us in the resurrection. That as we grow as we move into the resurrection, so to speak, we will see ourselves as we truly are, mirrored in that loving gaze of God. It's funny, think of it so much in terms of judgment. I want to put alongside that, but maybe what we'll encounter is a loving gaze. The stories we tell about ourselves, the images we have of God and ourselves as we move further through our lives, seems to become closer and closer approximations to the fullness of what we'll discover in the life of the resurrection. And so I'll finish with a quote from my former Jesuit general. He was talking this nearly, 8 years ago now. Sorry, no, more than that. 12 years ago. More than 12 years ago. He's talking to his fellow Jesuits, but also to other Christians. That our task is to help men and women disengage themselves from the tarnished and confused image that they have of themselves, in order to discover that they are in God's light, completely like Christ. Back to image, back to what Ignatius invites us to do, back to, for a last moment, what psychology tells us to do in terms of images and the unconscious. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If there's anyone that would like to ask a question, please do ask a question. I'll come to you with a microphone so everybody else can hear.
I just want to make a suggestion for a practice. Perhaps everyone who takes a copy of the lap of the pamphlet will photocopy a few and bring them back next week for those of us who have a copy.
My understanding is that there will be more copies available.
Good help.
Yeah, no, that it's going to be arranged, so you don't have to go and bring them back. Okay?
That's very interesting. Earlier on, you used the word in the context of imagining oneself in the gospel. You used the word fantasy.
Yeah.
And that sort of shocks me. One level in between imagining and fantasy. And there's a linked question to that, which is when we came to the end and we were talking about varying images of God. Does Ignatius allow that one can go beyond all image?
I'm sorry, I missed the word before image at the very end.
Does Ignatius allow for the possibility that one's contemplation of God goes totally beyond images?
Fine. Well, let me take the two questions in sequence. Well, again, if you want to settle back for the rest of the afternoon, we can talk about fantasy and imagination, and indeed the sort of ploy that some writers in psychoanalytic writing have of having two ways of writing fantasy, one with an F and one with a PH. To kind of distinguish between sort of levels of fantasy, or perhaps to step back from what we tend to sort of ascribe to fantasy as in some way not having weight or worth or whatever it might be. I'd want to say I don't want to put a division between the two. I think imaginative, our capacity to imagine, our capacity to create and, so to speak, partly inhabit imaginary worlds seems to me to be a crucial aspect of who we are. And play involves a measure of that. Nowadays, an awful lot of youngsters, at least, are, I hope, helped in that by electronic media, rather than stymied in that, or stultified their capacity to do that. So I wouldn't want to draw make a big division, okay? If you like, holy fantasy or holy imagining is our capacity to fantasize touched by the gospel. But that's a Jesuitical way out, all right? It's the same capacity, okay? That's what. Does Ignatius recognize and allow for ways of praying that go beyond imagery? Of course, yes. Yes. It's just that he suggests in the exercises that this imaginational prayer can be very helpful. If I can respond with a quick anecdote, this whole question came up on a sort of internal Jesuit level when one of our Japanese Jesuits, who was very much formed in the Zen tradition of meditation, kind of put the question, well, can I make the exercises Zen style? Well, can I spend my prayer sessions not imagining what Ignatius puts before me, but in Zazen? And the answer, because he kind of tried it, 30 days, but hey, 30 days for a Zen meditator is just warming up, you know? And the answer was yes. And that the dynamic of the exercises, that flow which is there through the pattern of the exercise, operates. And what he did was sort of, read the sorts of suggestions that Ignatius was making and so on, park them, and then put in his hours of prayer, just sitting meditation. And it was an effective way of engaging, which I think wouldn't be a great surprise to Zen masters, of whom there are a few Jesuits, I think, real ones, real Zen masters.
More questions?
Not quite certain if this is a question, rather a wonder I had as you were listening. And that is that I was wondering whether with Winnicott you were going to actually say that eventually we can get back to being small letters, omnipotent, as being, because we are we become part of God, as we discover Him, as it were, in the gap. I don't know whether that's also clear, but I wonder if you might make comments that it's a sense of Eckhart with things like the eyes that I look upon God, the same eyes that God looks upon me. My comment.
Okay. Let me try and respond to that. I'm not sure it was a question, and I'm not sure this is going to be an answer. But let me try and respond to what you said. I think Winnicott's description of that shift from there is simply that which is to there is me and others, kind of summarising it a bit, is the shift that allows relationship to be possible. It allows me to relate to another. Before that takes place, I can't be in relationship to another. And it seems to me that the language of the Christian mystics is careful to preserve that element of relationship to another. Ecstatic relationship is sometimes that the mystics call on the language of sexuality to capture somehow, but it's relationship with one and another, a loving relationship, mirroring the personal relationships, if you will, caught up in the personal relationships of the Trinity, over against an absorption into the deity or the divine, which other faith traditions see as our ultimate aim. And that preservation of relationship and a loving relationship between individuals, enduring individuals, seems to me to be crucial. But we're often looking for that fusion and loss of separateness. Because it was a great time to be around. It's a great way of hanging out.
As one who is absolutely right with spiritual direction, I wonder if you'd like to comment on it. spiritual direction in terms of growth and faith.
I was at a lecture last night in Blackfriars, not very surprisingly, on Aquinas. The chair said, we have time for one last question. And somebody said, what does Aquinas make of justification by grace alone? By faith alone? People thinking about their dinners. It seems to me that it's not an original thought at all. One of the great insights that's shared by all the faith traditions of the world at their best is that if you're going to commit yourself to serious prayer, to attempt to allow God to work in you, to make this a central relationship in your life, an explicit central relationship in your life, you need a guide. You need someone, not someone to tell you what to do, but someone to help you sort out what God is doing in your life and how you are responding. If you talk to at least the devotional strands of Islam, if you talk to Jews, if you talk to Hindus, they'll come up with exactly the same insight. If you're going to take the engagement with the divine seriously, I think the Buddhists will say the same, even though they're not meant to have a divine as such, but anyway. Then you need someone to be there with you, who may start off by being a bit of a teacher, but who shifts gradually into being someone with whom you work, who helps you understand what God is doing. And who sometimes, and I speak as someone who works as a spiritual director, sometimes ends up in the position of being a privileged witness of what God is doing in another person's life. But that there is someone other than yourself with whom you check things out seems to be a shared insight. It's not a million miles away from that insight which is there at the best in the helping professions at their best. That if you're going to engage with others in depth over time, you need a supervisor. Not someone who tells you what to do, but someone who helps you sift and understand and not be misled by what this deep engagement is doing with you. So I think, I have to say, that's a pure top of the head parallel. I hadn't made it before. You know, the language is that of direction, spiritual direction. It sounds direct. The experience is one of engagement, shared engagement, supervision in that sense, just as supervisor sounds wrong, but helping me understand what is happening at these deep levels of my life. We can fool ourselves. That's why therapists are still in business.
Can I just ask you one question myself? And that is, there are some people who see Ignatian spirituality and immediately think that this is all connected with sin, engagement with sin. However, we should put the emphasis on sin or on growth of spiritual life.
I think if that's the question we're asking in court, someone would be leaping up and saying, that's a leading question, my lord. It's a leading question. I blame James Joyce. If you haven't read The Portrait of the Artist as a young man, don't yet, until you've got a stronger grip on what Ignatius is really about. But there is that spectacular hellfire sermon in early chapter of James Joyce, and I'll illustrate that in an anecdote in 2 seconds, and I will shut up. No, the emphasis in the exercises, the emphasis in Ignatian spirituality is of growth and wonder at the love of God, the overwhelming love of God for someone who really doesn't do very well in response. You know, it's the imbalance. It's not that I'm a miserable sinner. It's how could I be loved so much? I think it's not a million miles away from what touches us when we are fortunate enough to meet someone who really loves us. You know, it's the same basic insight. But the imagery that gets associated with Ignatian spirituality is precisely the emphasis on sin and examination of conscience and all the rest of it. I'm sorry, I can't resist this anecdote, but If you will, imagine this church being longer and thinner, a bit narrower, transformed into a school, a boys' boarding school chapel 40 years ago. And one of my Jesuit predecessors, who was a bit into sin, is holding forth to 400 schoolboys. Half the boys in this school, he says, are in mortal sin at the moment. He doesn't name it, but they've all got a pretty good idea of what he's talking about. Half the boys in this, and here he makes a mistake, in this school are doomed to hell. At which point this lot will go, which suggests that they have a much healthier understanding of grace and sin and the love of God than the preacher did. The preacher is now with God, so he knows better.
Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture and it's made Ignatian spirituality come alive for you. If it has, please do come back next week, and as you go out, please empty your pockets full of change and notes into the baskets to pay for the future of the course. Is that right? Is that what I should have said? Okay. Welcome. Thank you for coming, and thank you very much for being here.